They say the scariest stories aren't about monsters that lurk under your bed, or shadows that creep across the walls. The scariest stories are the ones that are true. They're the ones where a real human voice, shaking, desperate, echoes through a phone line, reaching out for help, and then vanishes into the night. One such voice belonged to a young man named Brandon Lawson, whose final call to 911 still baffles investigators, terrifies listeners, and leaves families with unanswered questions. His case doesn't belong in a movie script, it belongs in reality. And reality is far more horrifying than anything fiction could invent. Tonight, we step into his world, but be warned, once you hear his story, you'll never forget it, because his voice, his final words, might just follow you long after this video ends. Brandon Lawson was not unlike countless other young men in Texas. He was 26 years old, a father, and someone who lived with the same struggles and ambitions that define ordinary life. He had a partner he loved, children who depended on him, and family who thought of him as more than just a son or a brother. To most, Brandon wasn't a headline, wasn't a statistic. He was simply a man navigating his life in rural Texas, a place where highways stretch into the horizon and where the silence of the desert night can make even the bravest person feel small. Yet, what makes Brandon different from most is that his story didn't end like everyone else's. It ended on a dark, lonely highway, with a phone call that has now become one of the most chilling mysteries in American history. On the evening of August 8, 2013, Brandon had an argument with his longtime girlfriend, Ladessa. Like many couples, they'd fought before. But that night, the fight escalated enough that Brandon decided to leave the house. He stormed out into the Texas night, angry, restless, and perhaps searching for an escape from the tension inside those walls. He got into his truck, a silver F-150, and drove off. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just another lover's quarrel, the kind that fades by morning. But for Brandon, it was the beginning of something far darker, something that no one could have predicted. As the night wore on, Brandon called his father and his brother, Kyle. He mentioned he was on his way to his father's house, but things didn't quite line up. The road stretched long and empty, surrounded by fields and patches of darkness that swallowed everything beyond the headlights. In West Texas, isolation isn't just a feeling, it's a reality. Out there, when you're alone, you're really alone. No nearby houses, no bustling gas stations, just miles of asphalt, the occasional rattlesnake, and the kind of silence that presses on your chest. Brandon drove, but as the clock ticked into the early hours of August 9th, something began to go wrong. At some point during his drive, Brandon's truck ran out of gas, stranded on U.S. Route 277, outside of Bronte, Texas. He found himself in the worst possible situation. Night surrounded him. The nearest town was miles away. And Brandon, alone on that empty stretch of highway, would soon make a call that turned his story into one of the most unsettling mysteries of the decade. But before that call, before his panicked voice echoed through the phone lines, he made another call, this one to his brother, Kyle. He told him he was out of gas, that he needed help. Kyle, concerned, agreed to come find him, bringing a can of fuel. What Kyle didn't know, what no one knew, was that Brandon's night was already unraveling into chaos. At 12:50 a.m., something happened. Brandon dialed 911. And what came through on that recording wasn't the calm, coherent plea of a man who simply needed fuel. It was the frantic, trembling voice of someone in danger. Someone who believed his life was at risk. His words were slurred, panicked, and almost swallowed by fear. The dispatcher tried to make sense of it, tried to piece together what Brandon was saying. But even today, the call remains disturbing, almost incomprehensible. Some phrases are clear enough to chill you to the bone. I ran into them. I need the cops. Please hurry. Words that suggest a man wasn't just stranded, he was being hunted. Imagine, for just a moment, the sound of your own heartbeat pounding in your ears, your breath ragged, your voice shaking as you try to explain to a stranger on the other end of the line that someone, or something, is after you. That was Brandon in that moment. A real man, alone on a dark road, crying out for help. And then, as suddenly as it began, the line went silent. By the time Kyle arrived at Brandon's truck, things had already taken a turn toward the inexplicable. The vehicle was there abandoned, but Brandon was nowhere to be found. His cell phone rang when called, but no one picked up. It was as though he had vanished into the night, swallowed by the darkness that stretched on both sides of the road. His keys, his wallet, gone with him. And all that was left was that eerie, haunting 911 call. What makes this story different from so many others is that it feels wrong in ways you can't quite explain. This wasn't just a case of someone getting lost, or simply deciding to disappear. Brandon's voice in that call wasn't calm. It wasn't resigned. It was terrified. He sounded like a man being chased. And if that's true, then the question remains, chased by who? Or what? The recording begins with static. Then, through the crackle of the line, comes Brandon's voice. To those who have listened, it's not a voice you easily forget. There's an urgency in his tone, the kind of urgency that doesn't come from simply being stranded. He tells the operator he needs the police, and that he's run into them. His words are strained, uneven, and barely coherent, like someone trying to speak while watching over their shoulder. Some words are debated to this day. Was he saying he was being chased? Was he talking about the first guys? Or was it something darker, words that the dispatcher couldn't quite understand, because no one was supposed to understand them? Whatever the case, one thing was crystal clear. Brandon was scared for his life. "I need the cops," he pleaded. "Please hurry." The call lasted less than a minute. A minute that, for Brandon, felt like a lifetime. Imagine being alone on that deserted stretch of road, the Texas sky above offering no light except the faint glow of stars, while your headlights cut into the night. You're out of gas. You're stranded. And, most terrifying of all, you believe you've just run into them. Who is them? Criminals? Strangers? Something supernatural? The words hang in the air even now, and they carry the weight of dread. By the time his brother, Kyle, arrived with the fuel can, the area was already crawling with unease. Brandon's truck sat tilted off the road, its hazard lights blinking into the night like a warning beacon. The silence was overwhelming, punctuated only by the occasional rush of passing cars on the distant highway. But of Brandon, there was no sign. He was gone. Not a trace. The surrounding field stretched wide and open, a sea of darkness that seemed to swallow everything. Kyle searched, calling his brother's name, expecting at any moment for Brandon to stumble out of the shadows. But no one came. The sheriff's deputies eventually arrived, responding to the 911 call. They searched the truck, searched the roadside. Nothing. It was as if Brandon had evaporated into the Texas air. His phone rang when they dialed it, but he didn't answer. Sometimes it went straight to voicemail. Sometimes it rang. Those brief glimmers of hope would only feed the growing horror, because it suggested he was still out there, alive, but unreachable. Think of the terror in that moment. Brandon had said he was in danger. His truck confirmed he'd been there, but now he was gone. Was he hiding, running through the fields under the cover of night? Or had something, or someone, taken him away? Every possible answer is worse than the last. For hours, family and deputies scoured the area. The dry Texas brush offered little cover, and the fields stretched endlessly into the night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the rustle of the wind through the grass made every shadow seem alive. If Brandon was out there, was he watching them? Was he injured, crawling somewhere, desperate for help? Or had the desert already swallowed him whole? Theories began to swirl almost immediately. Some believed Brandon had run into drug traffickers, men who used those rural highways for quiet exchanges. Others speculated he had been hallucinating, paranoid, and imagining threats that weren't there. But neither theory could explain the unease of that 911 call, the unmistakable fear in his voice, the panic that couldn't be faked. Brandon wasn't just confused. He wasn't just lost, he was terrified. And terror like that doesn't come from nowhere. By the time the sun rose over Coke County, Texas, Brandon Lawson had vanished without a trace. His truck remained, his voice lingered on the recording, but the man himself, gone. No footprints leading into the distance. No trail of belongings, nothing. Only the faint echo of his words, replayed endlessly. "I ran into them. Please hurry." To this day, that call remains one of the most haunting in 911 history. It's not just the content, it's the delivery. The human mind is wired to recognize fear in a voice, and Brandon's fear is undeniable. When people listened to the call, they often find themselves glancing over their shoulder, because it feels like whatever was after him is still out there, still waiting. That's the power of true terror. It doesn't stay on the recording. It seeps out, it infects you, and it makes you wonder, if it happened to him, could it happen to you? When the sun climbed over the horizon that morning, the fields of Coke County looked almost ordinary. The long stretches of dry grass swayed gently in the wind, the dirt roads stretched endlessly, and Brandon's truck sat like a lone monument to the chaos of the night before. But to those who knew what had happened, there was nothing ordinary about this landscape. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, every rustle of the brush sounded like a whisper of the truth. The man who had been there just hours before was gone, and the silence was crushing. Brandon Lawson was now officially missing. His family, shaken and desperate, refused to accept what the scene suggested, that he had simply vanished into thin air. They combed the fields tirelessly, calling his name, their voices carried by the wind into the vast emptiness. Deputies and volunteers joined in, scanning every patch of ground, every drainage ditch, every cluster of mesquite trees. Dogs were brought in, helicopters flew overhead, but the land gave up no secrets. The search ended the same way it began, with questions, with emptiness, with fear. At first, hope flickered. Brandon's cell phone occasionally rang when dialed, fueling the belief that he was still alive, still somewhere out there. Maybe he was hiding, maybe injured, maybe on the move. But as the hours bled into days, and the days into weeks, hope began to erode. The desert has a cruel way of keeping its secrets, swallowing footprints, silencing cries, and erasing signs of struggle. By the end of the summer, it was as if the earth itself had conspired to keep Brandon's fate locked away. Theories began to multiply like wildfire, each one darker than the last. Some believed Brandon had stumbled upon drug traffickers or smugglers that night, men who used those lonely highways for shadowy purposes. It would explain the panic in his voice, the cryptic line, "I ran into them." Had he seen something he wasn't supposed to see? Had he interrupted something that cost him his life? And if so, why had no evidence been found, no blood, no discarded items, no tire tracks leading into the unknown? For those who favored this theory, the desert wasn't the culprit. Men were. Men who knew how to disappear evidence as efficiently as they disappeared people. Others argued Brandon had been hallucinating, perhaps under the influence of drugs or in a state of paranoia. His brother Kyle later admitted Brandon had struggled with substance use, and that night he may have been out of his mind, running aimlessly into the night until exhaustion claimed him. But again, the theory doesn't explain everything. Even if he was hallucinating, where did he go? Where was his body? Searches covered miles upon miles of terrain, far more than someone in his condition could have traveled. Yet nothing turned up. No torn clothing snagged on barbed wire, no traces of dehydration or collapse. Nothing. And then there were the theories that dipped into something stranger. Some listeners of the 911 call swear they hear things in the background, other voices, faint noises, even gunshots muffled by distance. Was Brandon alone on that call, or was someone there with him? The audio is scratchy, distorted, filled with static, leaving plenty of room for interpretation. But once you hear those supposed whispers, it's hard to unhear them. It adds a layer of horror that even the rational mind struggles to dismiss. The paranormal explanations came next. Locals whispered about the land itself, about the stories of strange figures seen on those back roads, of people who vanished in the dead of night never to return. Was Brandon another victim of something beyond comprehension? Something that doesn't leave evidence because it doesn't exist in our world the way we understand it? The thought is chilling, but for some, it explains the unexplainable. Why would a grown man, terrified, vanish from the middle of a highway without a trace? Maybe the answer isn't human at all. Maybe it's something darker, something that lives in the cracks between our world and the next. What makes Brandon's case so haunting isn't just his disappearance, it's the recording that survives. That 911 call is the ghost that lingers, the piece of evidence that breathes life into the terror of that night. When you listen, you aren't just hearing words. You're hearing a man in his final known moments. You're hearing fear incarnate. And the more you listen, the more you realize the truth. Whatever happened to Brandon, it was real. His voice proves that. His panic proves that something was there in the dark with him, and it terrified him to his core. Years passed, and Brandon remained missing. His family refused to stop searching, never willing to let his name fade into the abyss. Candlelight vigils were held, flyers were spread, and social media lit up with theories and debates. The case became one of the internet's most discussed mysteries, with countless people dissecting every second of that call, every word, every pause, every muffled sound. Entire communities were built around trying to decode the audio, as though the answers were hidden just beneath the static, waiting for someone to unlock them. But no matter how many times it was analyzed, no matter how many theories emerged, the ending remained the same: Brandon was gone. It wasn't until 2022, nearly a decade later, that partial human remains were finally discovered in a field not far from where Brandon's truck was abandoned. DNA confirmed what his family had long feared: Brandon Lawson was dead. But even with this revelation, the case remains unsolved. The remains offered no clear cause of death, no answers to the questions that have haunted this case since day one. It only confirmed what everyone already knew: he never made it home. So we are left with the same questions, the same gnawing dread. Who were them? What exactly happened in those final moments? And why does that 911 call feel so different from others, so drenched in a terror that transcends explanation? Brandon Lawson's story isn't just a mystery. It's a warning, a reminder that sometimes the truth is stranger, darker, and far more horrifying than fiction. The desert still keeps its secrets. The static of the call still carries its chill, and the night Brandon vanished will forever echo with a single, haunting phrase: